Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Steph. Today we are doing something kind of fun. I'm doing a mashup of two different things. Basically, I'm tier ranking my 5-star reads from the last 3 years, and I'm also going to be paying attention to what I think they have in common and doing a very simple 5-star audit. So the 5-star audit was created by Meg from Meg with Books, and she kind of was going through all of her 5 stars and trying to figure out what they have in common in order to better understand her taste. I've seen other people do it on their channels, but I wanted to do the tier ranking because there are some of these books that I gave 5 stars that, listen, I stand by the fact that I gave them 5 stars, but I know myself now and I know that some of these 5 stars are a little bit questionable, or I was on the fence between like a 4, 4.5 and a 5 stars, and I ended up choosing a 5-star. I do have a few where my feelings have changed over time on them. I think that naturally happens when you sort of spend some time away from a book. But I did also want to direct you to a video where I went through my last 5-star reads of like, I think 5 years previous to 2020. I basically talk about would I give this a 5 stars today, knowing what I know about my taste and how it's changed. And this is kind of serving as a part 2 to that, simply because these are the 5 stars that I didn't go over in that video because I did want to do like a compare and contrasting type of thing, but I didn't know how to do that. And I think a tier ranking video is kind of the way to do it, as well as a 5-star audit. So the first tier is God tier. Yes, I would lay down my life for it, but it also changed my DNA in some way. I am not the same. Pre-reading that book me and post-reading that book me, 2 different people. Then the second tier we have would die for. I would still lay down my life for it, but it's not quite God tier, and I wouldn't say that I fundamentally went under a DNA change. The third tier is I wouldn't quite lay down my life for it, but I would lay over a puddle and let the carriage roll over me, maybe sustain a little bit of damage for the book, but I wouldn't quite die for it, you know? And then the last tier, we're questioning things. We really are. We're questioning that 5-star. We're questioning why I gave it a 5-star, but I would probably still put down a jacket so that they could safely cross that puddle without getting dirty. You know what I mean? I would sacrifice a jacket, but I wouldn't really sacrifice my body or my life. And I think the 5 stars is a little bit questionable. So we're just gonna start off the bat with Robin Hobb. If you're new here, hi, I love Robin Hobb. I'm a Robin Hobb apologist, even though I would really like to fight her. But I recently finished The Realm of the Elderlings and it ruined my life. It ruined my reading. So all 5 of these definitely have to be in God tier. My DNA has changed. It's changed the way that I am as a reader, and it's changed the things that I look for in fantasy especially. So then we have In the Dream House. And there are a couple nonfictions on here, but if you've watched the progression of my channel, you will know that I currently, and for the past like 2.5 years, I haven't really been rating nonfiction anymore. In the Dream House, I would definitely die for this. I would die for this book because I think that it was a very important read, but it was also one of those reads that was like extremely unique, especially in the way that it was written, and it was unlike any other experience I've had with a book, especially nonfiction. I can already see right off the bat, if we're talking about like what these books have in common, despite one being nonfiction and one being fiction, or 5 being fiction. I love things that devastate me. I love sad books. I really do. Primarily, the books that I end up loving and connecting to have a lot of devastation in them. And both The Realm of the Elderlings and In the Dream House have a lot of grief and devastation. Okay, then we have The Bone Houses, which was just one of those books that I ended up reading in one sitting and I really, really love. I would have to say that I would lay over a puddle for it. I wouldn't die for it. It's not God tier. It was just one of those books that I really appreciated in the moment. I think one of the things that really gets me about this book is how whimsical and unexpected it was for me, but also there's chronic pain rep, and it actually felt very real to what I experienced and how I was feeling. I've never seen a character, especially in a fantasy world, have chronic pain and actually deal with it and talk about it in a way that was so relatable to me. So yeah, I would lay over a puddle for it. Prince and the Dressmaker, I would die for. I have such a soft spot for queer coming of age books, and this is very much queer and it's beautiful and I love the characters. I've reread this a few times actually, which is why it's in this, because I think I read it in 2019, but I've reread it a couple times since then. Okay, the 5th season. The 5th season is God tier. DNA changed. I think about the twists and turns in the 5th season probably every other month. Like, I think about it all the time. When anyone is reading the 5th season, I always get so excited for them because the twists and turns that are coming at you. But you will notice that the rest of the books did not make it into the 5-star category. And that's just because the series like took a turn in a way where it wasn't as exciting as the first book, and it just didn't hit me the way the first book did. But I think overall that series in general is just one of my favorite series of all time. So with the books that are on the board right now, we can see a few things in common, but also things that kind of don't make sense. And I think that's why this tier ranking is important, because the Bone season, it was really just about the chronic pain rep. I couldn't say that this has anything in common with any of the other books here, but I do see that in the Dream House and the Prince and the Dressmaker, while one is heartwarming and just lovely and the other one is very heartbreaking, they do both deal with queerness and coming out and like coming to terms with your identity, which is something that is definitely a theme that I look for. So I already feel like we have a lot of commonality there. In terms of the fantasy, even though I feel like the 5th season is more of like a sci fantasy, I do again see the theme of devastation, because the 5th season is a very devastating read. But interestingly enough, something that's really different between, I think, the Realm of the Elderlings and the 5th season is, like I said, the 5th season focuses a lot on a very complex world and magic system that does, for the most part, get explained to you. Whether or not I understood it is a different story, but it does get explained to you and explored pretty heavily, whereas in the Realm of the Elderlings, it's all about characters. So I think that's an interesting dynamic here, that those two are very opposite. Okay, so we have Ember in the Ashes, which is probably a very controversial book, but I would die for this series in general. I am so in love with desert fantasy now, so I struggle because I want to put it in God tier, but I think I'm going to keep it in would die for, because upon reread, I wasn't as in love with it as I was before, I guess. But we are seeing again another trend, devastation. We have another polarizing one, but I'm not gonna lie to you, Raven Boys, God tier. It's God tier for me. I have reread this series 5 times, and every single time it just gets better and better and better for me. And the fun thing about it is that every single time my favorite book in the series changes. Never has it been the last one. Okay, we'll just get that out of the way. The last one will never be a 5 stars. We're just counting the Raven Boys series as a whole at this point. All of them, I love them to death. The last one is not quite ever going to be a 5 stars for me, but the more that I read it, the more I appreciate it. I love it. So what this brings me to, and I'm glad that we got here so soon, you know, because I have been saying this since the dawn of time about my reading. I'm a character-driven reader. If you give me no plot, just vibes, great characters, I will probably, if I love the characters, I will probably give it 5 stars. And that is exactly what the Raven Boys is. So I think that if you go into the Raven Boys hoping for like this concrete plot, you're gonna be chasing it around in circles and you're never gonna have a good time. And so I just know that in terms of the 5-star audit portion of this, it's character driven. It's all about the characters. That's what gets me. I love these characters. And that's the other thing that's really cool about this series too. The more that I reread it, the more that I appreciate characters that I kind of hated before or sort of brushed off. All that's to say is that you could even argue that Realm of the Elderlings is more character driven. So I do have a tendency to really fall for characters. Okay, and then we have Alatsawe. I really loved it in the moment, but I have no desire to really reread it. A weird thing for me is that I can have 5-star reads and never want to reread them. I mean, I guess it's not weird because there are a lot of people who don't reread at all. But for me, I'm actually a really big rereader. I love rereading books. I love spending time in worlds forever and ever and ever, which is why I reread The Raven Boys like immediately after finishing it. I haven't done it as much now that I make YouTube videos, but I still really love rereading, and one of the things that I measure a favorite book off of, I guess, is how willing I am to reread it. So I can definitely say with like Alatsawe and the Bone Houses, I wouldn't reread them. And as a matter of fact, I don't even think I own the Bone Houses anymore, do I? Black Sun. This is another one that I think I'm shockingly putting I'd lay over a puddle for. I loved it in the moment of reading it, but I have never had any desire to move on with the series. I'm going to at some point. I am, because I really enjoyed my experience reading Black Sun. There's just something about it where I never wanted to move on, which is usually not the best sign, and I've never had any desire to reread it. So this is where I struggle, because I'm trying to remember why I gave it a 5 stars in the first place. I think it was just I really enjoyed the characters and like the explosive ending of it all, but I don't actually quite remember why I gave it 5 stars. The space between worlds, the more time I've taken away from it, it's also, I would lay over a puddle for it. I do think that this one has so much in common actually with a lot of different themes that I go for in books. One of them being that it's queer normative. The second one is it has like a dystopian vibe to it, and I do really enjoy dystopians. I think that's also why I really loved the 5th season. And it's devastating. It's a very sad read. It deals with a lot of domestic abuse and sadness and depression, etc., but it does have more of a, I think, a happier ending. But this one is definitely, I would lay over a puddle. I'm glad that I read it. I really enjoyed it. Okay, so Grown by Tiffany Jackson. This is one that is questionable to me. I'm questioning things. The further away from it I've gotten, the more I'm like, I don't think I liked this story as much as I did when I like finished it. I don't really read a lot of thrillers. But the thing is that when I do give a thriller a chance, it's always the twists and the turns that get me, because that's the point of a thriller. And then I'm like, wait, this is so good. But then I spend time away from it and I'm like, was it? And Grown is very much that way. And I felt that way about most of Tiffany Jackson's books. This was my first Tiffany Jackson, and I think she does a really great job of making you get very invested into the story and then giving you devastating reveals by the end. So then we have The Only Good Indians, and actually I want to put these books together because I read them around the same time. Okay, so I moved some things around because the next 3 books were horror books that I read around the same time, and it was what kind of unlocked me really getting into horror. First one I read was The Only Good Indians, and I would definitely die for this book because it was the first time that I had read something that was fairly grotesque to me, and I was like, wow, I can handle horror in reading, because if you don't know, I am a huge chicken and I cannot watch horror. I can't watch it for the life of me. I hate it. But reading it is very fun, and I do get the feeling of wanting to be like uncomfortable and stuff. So The Only Good Indians was like the first horror that I read straight through, and I was like, I think I like this, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. The Only Good Indians just like changed me a little bit as a reader, but not fully my DNA. But it definitely started to unlock something in me, right? And then I read Ring Shout, and this is God tier changed my DNA. This is when I was like, wow, I really can handle horror and I can really enjoy it. Also, it started to unlock this idea that maybe I like social horror, because The Only Good Indians arguably is also a social horror. And then I read The Good House, and that solidified what I like in horror, and it was God tier changed my DNA as well. It's the one horror book that I constantly recommend to people, even though I know that most people aren't gonna like it the way that I liked it. First off, I'm a Casper girl through and through. Loved Casper, love haunted houses, love ghosts. My problem is that most ghost stories, especially in books, now that I've been reading more ghost stories, never fully go there, but Tananarive Due, she went there, and she really gave us a ghost story. And it just definitely solidified for me how much I love social commentary within horror, because while this is a ghost story, there's also underpinnings of social commentary, and that's just kind of what I think Tananarive Due does, especially now having read The Reformatory. So going back to the 5-star audit, we can then see that in all 3 of the horrors that I've given 5 stars that I like started out with, one thing has remained the same, and it's that I really love social horror. So if we're staying on theme with the horror, I'm actually just gonna rank all of these horror books because I feel like all of them have a little bit something in common. Okay, so first we have This Thing Between Us, and honestly, I would die for this book. I would. But then we have Moon of the Crusted Snow. This is another one that I would die for. This is like an insular type of horror that is happening within a community, and it also has a lot of social commentary in it. We have Monstrilio, which I actually am gonna say is God tier for me. It changed my DNA. Absolutely loved it. Another grief horror. Then we have Just Like Mother, which I'm gonna say that I would lay over a puddle for. It's one of those books that upon finishing it, yes, it was a 5-star for me, and it really blew my mind apart. And it made interesting commentary on motherhood as a whole. But it's one of those books that I'm glad I read it. I rated it highly, but I'll never return to it, and I don't really recommend it that highly. I don't think it's one of those books that like large amounts of people are gonna love, but I think if you like culty books and they work really well for you, then you will probably very much enjoy this. That reminded me, I actually want to add one more on here, and that's The Push, because The Push is one of those that I would also die for. I know it's a polarizing read for people, but it's another one that made such interesting commentary on motherhood, and it also also had an ending where my jaw was on the floor. So that being said, we have all of these horrors on here. We have Ring Shout, The Good House, Monstrilio, The Only Good Indians, This Thing Between Us, Moon of the Crusted Snow, and The Push. And so this is where things got really interesting with my love for horror and what I like in horror. What I have found to be tried and true with horror these days and what I like in horror is social horrors and grief horrors. I like anything that has something to do with social commentary, whether that's about racism, whether that's about motherhood, whether it's about being a woman, whether it's about queerness, whether it's about the beauty industry. I just recently read Natural Beauty, loved the social commentary in it. So I really love social horrors. And then grief horror. Grief horror is something that was completely unlocked for me because of This Thing Between Us, but Monstrilio was the thing that really solidified the fact that I love grief horror. And you can argue that in The Good House, in Ring Shout, and in The Only Good Indians, as well as Moon of the Crusted Snow, you could argue that in all of those books, grief is a huge driving force within all of them, along with the grotesque, along with the social commentary. Grief is a major theme in them as well. So yeah, grief horror, social horror, anything that's kind of slow and eerie, anything that kind of keeps me on the edge of my seat, but I can't figure out why. There's just like a tone to it. It's not necessarily that all of these jump scares are happening or grotesque things are constantly happening throughout the book. It's just something eerie and unsettling about it. I feel like I've pinned down my horror taste pretty well, and as a matter of fact, this is not necessarily a horror, even though arguably people put it in the horror section. I do think it's more of a literary horror, but Our Wives Under the Sea is another book that I would die for. First off, I loved the lyrical writing of it, but also this is all about grief. This is all about the loss of a partner, and it was just very devastating. I mean, arguably you could say this is horror. It all depends on what you classify as horror. It definitely is the horrors of loss, the horror of grief, but the ending arguably is kind of horror-esque. So it all depends on what you describe as horror. I would say if anything, this more falls under literary horror, but who am I? We then have If Beale Street Could Talk. I definitely would die for this book. I really, really loved this. This is my first James Baldwin, and I don't read a lot of classics, but this one just really, really worked for me. Daisy Jones and the Six is one I'm questioning. I know this author is loved. And listen, I gave Daisy Jones and the Six a 5 stars, but having taken time away from it and like watching the show, I don't really know why I gave it 5 stars. This is one where I do question why I gave this 5 stars, but I think it was mainly because of the format of it. It was an interview format, and at the time I had never really read anything that was interview format, and it seemed to work for me in that moment, but I question this one, honestly. In a fun turn of events, my webpage decided to refresh and it lost everything. So here's hoping that that doesn't happen again, and if it does, then I don't know if I can continue on with this. Okay, let's try to get through these fairly quickly so that we can get to the point. So anyway, going back to this, like I said before, don't really rate nonfiction anymore, but the few that I did rate 5 stars have made it on here. Heavy is one of those. This is a god tier book for me. It really changed me as a human being. I will never forget my time reading this book. I was literally cooking dinner, chopping onions, funny enough, sobbing into them because of what this book was doing to me. It also really unlocked how much I love memoirs. Okay, defy me. Yes, I'm embarrassed by it. I'm embarrassed by it, and I'm only embarrassed by it and questioning it, might put my jacket over a puddle for it, because I read everything in the Shatter Me world. And this was the only one that I gave 5 stars, okay? The frustrating part about it was that the series seemed like it was going in the direction of what I wanted from Shatter Me, and then it went downhill. And I do regret this 5 stars, but it was 5 stars nonetheless. Transcendent Kingdom, I would lay over a puddle for this one. It's not quite life-changing, but I really, really loved it, and it was one of those books that I kind of consumed in one sitting and really enjoyed the writing, really enjoyed the messages of it. And as a matter of fact, while we're here, I also gave Homegoing 5 stars, another one that I would lay over a puddle because I just loved it so much. I loved the way that it was told in vignettes and it was interweaving. It was such a great story, and it's one of the few historical fictions that I've really, really loved. This is another memoir that I gave 5 stars. I would definitely die for this one. I actually read all 3 of these books around the same time, and it was just hit after hit after hit. And All Boys Aren't Blue almost read like a coming of age queer narrative because our author is actually non-binary, and they were talking about their experience being queer and non-binary and what that looked like growing up in the Black community. And I really, really enjoyed this memoir. So you can already tell from here, if we are looking at nonfiction, what I'm looking at in nonfiction, we have heavy All Boys Aren't Blue, and then we have The Dream House. And in all three of those nonfictions, they are memoirs. And while The Dream House kind of does something significantly different than the other two, they're all memoirs that are kind of like coming of age and learning these really huge and sometimes devastating lessons in your life, or going through these really devastating parts of your life and growing up and how it's very messy. But there's also a lot of social commentary, because in Heavy and All Boys Aren't Blue, they're really discussing the Black American experience. And then in The Dream House, she is Latina and she's talking about her experience being a queer woman. There's a lot of discussions of not wanting to be a stereotype and also proving people wrong about being queer. And Carmen Maria Machado ends up in an abusive relationship and she's trying to reconcile with that. So memoirs and heavy topics. Very, very common for me. Those are very commonplace. We have The Poppy War, and this one, I'm just gonna say right now, I'm gonna put it in I'd Lay Over a Puddle because I do think about it a lot, but it is one of those books that I literally read at the very beginning of the pandemic. For me, I was just trying to escape in any way that I possibly could, like I think many of us were. So I can't even say how I really feel about The Poppy War. I remember a lot of it, but I also don't, and I also am not even sure if I have real concrete thoughts on this. So I'm only putting it in this category because I just don't know what my actual feelings on this book are. And I do plan to reread it and move on with the rest of the series. Clap When You Land, I would die for this book. Since we're on Elizabeth Acevedo, let's also put The Poet X in I Would Die For. I only really loved these two books. I tried to read her adult novel and I ended up DNFing it. But Clap When You Land and The Poet X just kind of did something for me within contemporary. Like there was a lot of issues about queerness, because that's a theme in my life, and trying to come to terms with your family. These were like huge things within both of these books. They were also written in verse, and Black Flamingo is also written in verse, which absolutely loved. These really are the only three books written in verse that I really like, but I still, despite this, don't gravitate towards books written in verse, and I don't really enjoy poetry. Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I question this one. Again, another one that I read during the pandemic. It wasn't actually that long after The Poppy War. Did I like it? I don't know. I think I just liked the narration. Other than that, like, I don't have the best feelings surrounding it. Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. I actually would die for this one, which sucks because I did not like the rest of the series. Another one that I read in the pandemic, but it was more, we were pretty well through 2020 when I read it in one sitting, was Riveted. Loved it. Loved every second of it. It was so fun. This one, I wouldn't classify it as cozy sci-fi because actually, let's start talking about cozy sci-fi. That is another thing that I feel is going to be brought up more in here maybe. Cozy sci-fi is the thing that I've realized that I really love. I wouldn't say Skyward is completely a cozy sci-fi, but it does give those vibes because I felt like Skyward, a big reason why I liked it, it was character driven. And we also have The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet. I would also die for The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet. This is a cozy sci-fi through and through. If you've been around, I struggle with sci-fi, like hard sci-fis, but cozy sci-fis just do something for me. So I feel like Skyward sort of fell under that, but not completely. It still had some more adventure, I guess, in it. I don't really know what you would classify it. I feel like it's just a typical sci-fi. The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet is definitely cozy sci-fi. So if we're on sci-fi right now, I guess it would be time to talk about The Vanished Birds. And come on, we know where this is gonna go. We know, right? God tier? God tier. Come on. It was my favorite book of last year. And I know that this isn't a book that works for everyone, but it is a sci-fi, and in ways it's a cozy sci-fi. In reality, the way that I feel like it relates to The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet more specifically than Skyward is it's very, very character driven. And yes, the sci-fi in ways does matter, but it's more about like the politics in the world than anything else, or I guess the universe, because it's definitely more than just earth. But I feel like The Vanished Birds is just like burned into my DNA, burned into my retinas. The writing is beautiful. I just felt so devastated by so many things that were happening in here. I just had such a heavy attachment to the characters, and I really, really loved the characters so much. And that's why it kind of reminded me of The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet, because I also was very connected to the characters, and I felt like I didn't have to understand the science behind it all or the world building that much behind it all, simply because I was so attached to the characters and that's what mattered more. I feel like The Vanished Birds, you kind of have to understand the politics a little bit more to get why certain things are happening to the characters, but kind of what remains the same between the two is just characters. It's very character driven, and it's all about this found family. So I guess that's another thing that I love is found family, which I don't know why I don't hit on that sooner, but for me, a common theme for a lot of these, especially in like queer coming of age and a lot of the fantasies that I love. The Raven Boys is a really great example of this. There's just like so much found family in a lot of these books. I think that's a supreme trope for most people, but that is definitely like one of my favorite tropes. Well, then we have Heartstopper, and you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of The Prince and the Dressmaker, so I'm gonna put it next to that one, and I'm also going to put up here Mooncakes, as I would die for these books. I would die for all three of these. Oh, and Magic Fish and On a Sunbeam I will have to put here as well. So all five of these are YA graphic novels, and I don't know, I guess it's when I read Heartstopper. I feel like Heartstopper was the first YA graphic novel that I read and I fell in love with, other than Pumpkinheads. Which isn't on here because I guess the first time I read it, I did not give it 5 stars. Either way, these graphic novels, these YA graphic novels, there is just something about them. The coziness of them just really gets me. And I fell in love, especially in 2020, with YA graphic novels. And there is a special place in my heart for like most of them. But these ones were the ones that I read pretty close together, and I just absolutely loved them. On a Sunbeam and Magic Fish and Mooncakes and Heartstopper, all of them, they're all queer. So it's all coming together. It's all coming back to the same things. It's all coming back to me now. Okay, we have The Bluest Eye. This is God tier, changed my DNA. That was my first Toni Morrison, not my last. I think about The Bluest Eye all the time. I cried so much at this book, and I thought about it so much. It consumed so many of my thoughts because the messages behind it, everything that happened to these girls, just devastation. No breathing, don't give a fuck. We have The Name of the Wind. I can't lie to you. This is gonna go between a puddle and we're questioning things, but I'm gonna put it on a puddle. And that's just because like I read it, and even looking back at it, I just am like, it's fine. It's fine. It's not the end all be all. I have no desire to move on with this series. I couldn't care less when the next one gets published, but I loved the storytelling aspect to it. That was my favorite part of The Name of the Wind, and that's probably why I gave it 5 stars, because I was not attached to any of the characters, and I often seek out books that have this type of storytelling in it. I don't think about this book as fondly as I should, considering it's 5 stars. Vampires of El Norte, would die for this book. I would die for it! This is classified as a horror, but I feel like it's a romance book with some paranormal stuff sprinkled in, and I loved it. It was perfect, no notes. The Goblin Emperor, this is God tier DNA changing for me because it reminded me so much of Fitz from The Realm of the Elderlings. Need I say more? And I think it's probably the closest thing I have found to The Realm of the Elderlings, but that's not saying much because I don't actually think that if you like The Realm of the Elderlings that you'll just automatically like The Goblin Emperor or vice versa. But if you like the trope, if that's even a trope, you like the fact that Fitz is a little boy that's suffering through life, then you might like Maya, who is also a younger goblin boy suffering through life. I gave The Rage of Dragons 5 stars. I would lay over a puddle for it. I wouldn't quite die for this book, but I do think of this one fondly. And that's why these tier rankings mean nothing, apparently, because when you're next to The Name of the Wind, where I said that I don't really have that fond feelings of it, but I still give it 5 stars, and then there's Rage of Dragons, which I do think of fondly, and I did give it 5 stars, maybe it's meaningless. Maybe everything is meaningless in this universe. Part of Your World, I would die for this book. This is one of my few 5-star romances. Yes, I have All Roads, which I would die for, and Honey and Spice, which I'm gonna say is God tier. I don't really consider Honey Girl a romance, so we'll get into that. But these three are actually romance books. They're considered romance books, and I loved them. There was banter, there was funny moments, there were moments where the characters were trying to go on like these healing journeys, which is a huge thing for me. I also really love small town romances, so that's why Part of Your World and All Roads Lead Here really worked well for me. But Honey and Spice, it almost feels kind of small town because it's just within this college setting. But with Honey and Spice, it's like the banter, everything that's going on in the plot, the side characters, like I was obsessed with everything. And All Roads Lead Here actually, I think, was my first contemporary romance of last year. Since I mentioned it, we can talk about Honey Girl. This is one where I'm questioning why I gave it 5 stars. I don't really remember anything about this book. I just remember that it definitely wasn't a romance, and I think I just liked the whole questioning life and life circumstances and like changing your career when you're in your 30s and what that looks like. I'm pretty sure that's what this book is about, and I think that's why I gave it 5 stars, but otherwise I couldn't really tell you why I gave it 5 stars. There are also 2 other ones that are romance adjacent, have some romance in them. You Make a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. I would die for this book. I know that this is a book that's been hit or miss for people, but it just really worked for me when I read it, and I think honestly that has to do with the grief that's explored in this book. I don't know that I fully call it romance. There is romance in it, and definitely like a happily ever after type of situation, but it's really about our character's healing journey. So I feel like you can consider it a literary romance. And then we have like a fantasy romance, which is That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. And this one I would put in I Would Lay Over a Puddle. I thought it was really, really fun. Another fantasy romance that we have is Blood Solace, which I'm sorry, it's God tier for me. It changed my DNA. It's the only 5 stars that I've given in this series, even though I love the series. This one, like, I was crying through the whole thing. I don't know what it was about this book that just got me. There's just something about like being introduced to another aspect of the world building in here that worked well for me. Something about the characters coming together, something about the found family. Just so much worked. I cried a lot. Really loved this. Another fantasy romance that we have is Daughter of the Moon Goddess, which is one that I would definitely die for. I love Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I'm nervous to go into the second one. There's that, but I really loved Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I know it didn't work for a lot of people. I still am someone who loves a love triangle. I know that's cliche, but I do still really have a fun time with a love triangle. It's funny, since we were talking about fantasy romance, the things that I like in fantasy romance really, really vary, I feel, but the one thing that kind of remains the same for me in almost all of my romances is slow burn. Absolutely love slow burn romances. It is one of my favorite things. That is God tier. If I had to rank tropes, slow burn is like God tier. I am starting to really like the touch her and you die type of trope as well, but I also really eat up the cinnamon roll guy. Like Leo and Blood Solace is just a little cinnamon roll. So I guess we're moving back to fantasy. So I have Down Among the Sticks and Bones and Every Heart a Dower Away, and I'm putting both of those, and I would definitely lay over a puddle for them. There's something about the Wayward Children series where I love it and I enjoy reading it, but for some reason it's not God tier for me. Like I'm never rushed to go out and read the newest installment. Like the newest installment already came out and I'm still 3 behind. I'm not that desperate to read the next ones in the series. Another fantasy series where I actually would die for. I would die for Queen of Shadows and Empire of Storms specifically, only because I love the characters so much. I could leave so much of the series behind, but the characters to me, like, I love them so much, but in Queen of Shadows, that's when the characters really start to be standout characters in my mind, and like characters that I grew very, very attached to. So it's hard to say that it's God tier because I don't really feel that way about any of her books, but I would definitely die for many of these characters. Going back to being a character-driven reader, but I think we already knew that. So why did I do this 5-star audit? I don't know. Apparently I know my taste well enough. I also want to talk about Kingdom of Copper and The River of Silver because, besties, I would die for that. It was DNA changing. It was God tier. I didn't even love City of Brass that much when I first read it, but then I read Kingdom of Copper and everything changed. And what solidified it? River of Silver. God tier. Need I say more? Like, I love that series. I think about the characters all the time. And River of Silver made me think that, like, maybe we do need more short story collections about our favorite fantasy worlds. Maybe short story collections about our favorite fantasy worlds and characters deserve rights. Listen, we're getting down to the wire. We're getting down to the wire. We're finally getting there. So we're just gonna continue on with fantasy. We have The Empress of Salt and Sorrow. I would definitely lay in a puddle over this book. I really enjoyed this story, but I have not moved on with the series. Even though I felt like I wanted to move on, I still haven't. I do want to reread it, so I have to say that I would lay over a puddle and not exactly die for it or that it was DNA changing, but I do hope that as I continue on with the series, my feelings start to change. Similarly, we have Legends and Lattes. This is one that I would lay in a puddle over. I really loved this because I like a cozy fantasy, but I won't lie, cozy sci-fi hits different for me than cozy fantasy. We also have We Hunt the Flame and We Free the Stars, and I'm gonna say that I would lay over a puddle for these. I wouldn't exactly say that I would die for them or that it was DNA changing. Similar to Ember in the Ashes, I really love this series, despite the fact that it's polarizing for most readers. Most people don't like this duology, but I really had a good time. Again, I love desert fantasy, so I think maybe I'm a little more forgiving with desert fantasy than any other fantasy because I love the setting so much. That being said though, I don't actually remember a ton about the characters and what even happens in the second book, but I gave both of these 5 stars. I do at one point want to reread them, but I'm not like rushing out to reread them right now. I also have The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, and this is a book that I would die for. I just love this. This one hit me at the right time. Like, I annotated the shit out of this book, and I definitely want to reread it sometime soon. Then we have Upon a Burning Throne. I'm gonna say that I don't want to quite say that we're questioning things, but I would definitely lay over a puddle for it. This series kind of got ruined for me based on publishing. Like, a whole bunch of publishing stuff happened with this series, so I will never move past Once Upon a Burning Throne. But when I read Once Upon a Burning Throne, I had a really good time. And I don't think it's for everyone. There's a lot of moving pieces, there's a lot of different characters, but when I read it, I had a really good time. It's just sadly I won't be moving on with this series, but I definitely want to read more by this author. We also have Silver in the Wood, which I would die for. I really loved this duology, the Drowning Country duology, but the second one was definitely much weaker than the first book. But I have to say, I loved this first book. It is the epitome of autumn and just like gives you that feeling of being in the woods when the leaves are dying and the weather is changing. It was such a beautiful and descriptive and atmospheric read, and I really loved it, and I liked the little romance that was happening in it as well. But the second book just wasn't the same. We have Sword of Kaigan. This is DNA changing, god tier. This book devastated me. I cried so hard at so many parts in this book. I've never stopped thinking about it. I don't know what else to say about it other than it's so fucking devastating. And I don't think it needs to be said anymore. My theme is devastation, no breathing. Because if we're on that topic of devastation, we need to put the whole Jade City series. I don't know why I didn't just put Jade City to represent the entirety of the trilogy, but this trilogy, god tier. Never the same. Show-stopping. Incredible. Throwing up. I don't know what to tell you. It's one of my favorite series of all time. So that was technically the last of the fantasy, but we do have the Paper Menageries, which is a short story collection that I would die for. It's literally one of 2 short story collections here that I've given 5 stars, and it is the only one of the 2 that isn't already in a world that I love, but it was my introduction to Ken Liu and absolutely loved it. The Paper Menagerie short story itself is devastating, and anyone who's read it can tell you that it ruins lives. We then have Ophelia After All. This is one that I would lay over a puddle for. I definitely would put it higher, but it's not something I think about all the time, despite the fact that I saw myself very heavily in this book, and I was very excited that it was a coming-of-age queer novel that didn't have a romance. But that being said, I don't think about it as often as other books that are queer coming-of-age novels, so I would have to say I would lay over a puddle for that one. This Place, 500 Years Retold. This is such a weird one for me to like rate, but I guess I would die for it. It's a graphic novel, actually short story collection, so I guess the 3rd short story collection, and it's telling literally 500 years of history retold from an indigenous lens, and I really enjoyed my time, and the art was beautiful in here, and I really love a lot of these authors. I've read many of their books before, and I also discovered a lot of new authors. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. I did give this 5 stars, and I guess I would lay over a puddle for it because I do think fondly of it. The Weight of the Stars by Kay Ingram. I'm gonna put this in I would die for. I want to put it in God tier, but I'm not going to. I do think it's I would die for it. I sobbed like a little baby at this book because of found family. It's also queer. It's a coming of age story. There's like a really sweet romance that happens. Just insert the Oprah Winfrey meme right now, because that's me during this 5-star audit / tier ranking. Like, I'm thinking maybe I wasted all of our times, because maybe I do just know my taste. Maybe I do. Maybe I actually have a good understanding of why I like things. Before the Devil Breaks You, so this one sucks because I want to put it in would die for, and maybe I just will. I'm gonna say I'd lay over a puddle. This is one of those series that, like, why did it end like that? This is in the Diviners world, and the ending of the Diviners sucks, but actual but. And I was just so disappointed by the trajectory of this series, but this book specifically was very creepy, and it took place in an asylum, which if you've ever watched American Horror Story, the asylum season really messed me up. But I can't really say that I have the most fond memories of the series anymore because the ending sucked so bad. So sadly, I think I would just lay over a puddle for it at this point. Bunny, I would say, is DNA changing, life-changing, God tier, and now I love weird girl fiction. And that's something I don't have a lot of 5 stars in, but I do love weird girl fiction, and I normally give it very high 4 stars. So Bunny really did that for me. The one that I think I really missed with my rating on was definitely Catherine House. I gave it a 4 stars, maybe a 3 stars, and I haven't changed my rating, but I definitely feel now, looking back at Catherine House, it should have been a 5 stars because of how much I think about it. I'm not necessarily anti-changing my rating, so I don't know why, I just don't. But for the sake of this video, like, the things I truly gave 5 stars in the moment are these. I guess another one that's kind of a weird girl fiction is The Convenience Store Woman. I'm gonna put in would die for because I was so surprised at how much I loved this one. I ended up reading this randomly for a video where I was reading like one of my favorite influencers, and this was one of the books she read and was really raving about. And I read it in one sitting. I mean, it's really short, and I was obsessed with it. It's definitely a weird girl fiction that if you like weird literary books, this will definitely be for you. But if you don't, I wouldn't waste your time. So we have another nonfiction, and again, this is like very weird to rank, I guess. And that's another reason why I don't rate nonfiction. But I would definitely say this was DNA changing, simply because this is talking all about residential schools, and specifically the impacts of residential schools and the stories of 7 different Indigenous children who died as a result of residential schools and how it has changed the education system in Canada. I would say it's DNA changing because I think that every single person should read it. I guess since we're on nonfiction, I also have Heartberries, which I would die for. This is another Indigenous memoir, and I just really loved this story. It's very short, and the author is actually a poet, so it's very lyrical as well, and I loved the way that it was written, and it was just extremely impactful, especially for how short it was. Ooh, Sorrowland. This is another horror. This is kind of a culty horror. I would say that this is God tier, DNA changing. I love this book. I love this book so much. This is more of a body horror, but it also has social commentary. There's a lot of grief in here as well. The main character is running from a cult, so there's some culty aspects. So this kind of has like so many of the things that I love in a lot of these individual horrors. Like Monstrilio is a grief horror, but there is some body horror in it as well. Ring Shout has a lot of body horror in it. Obviously, a lot of the horrors that I've talked about have social commentary as well. So this is just very on par with what I've been saying. We have The Firekeeper's Daughter, and I would definitely lay over a puddle for this one. It's another one of those like YA thrillers, but I think this one was really interesting because it had, again, a lot of social commentary. So I think in most like fiction, I tend to like things that have commentary of some sort. And while The Firekeeper's Daughter is a thriller, it also has a lot of contemporary elements because the main character is in high school, and she's also just dealing with family and life as well as this side thing that's more thrillery and like a mystery, which I guess also goes hand in hand with The Good Girl's Guide to Murder. Then we have The Break, and this one is definitely one that I would die for. So this is mainly about the strength and connections of Indigenous women and community with each other, especially in the face of colonization and racism, and the way that they hold each other up. It's almost like a love letter that Catherine wrote to the Indigenous women in her life. And honestly, I was devastated by this book. It made me sob. And then our last book book, Felix Ever After, is one that I would also die for. This is a queer, trans, coming-of-age novel, and I really, really loved it. It was also one of those books that I put off for far too long. Far too long. Looks like we made it. Okay, friends, so we've made it. So that is my tier ranking of the 5-star reads that I've had in the last 3 years. And the things that I've noticed about them, I've pretty much talked through this whole time, but the major things that I've noticed is that I love devastation. Devastation, destruction, my emotions obliterated. That's one of my #1 favorite things. 2, I love queer/queer coming of age novels, anything that's kind of talking about identities, specifically queer identity. But I also like social commentary in literary fiction and horror in general that could be talking about many different social things. I love a memoir. I love a memoir. Obviously, I love found family. Found family is my favorite trope. And then obviously I love slow burn. That's like my second favorite trope, I guess. If I also had to look at this, I mean, I think it's a pretty good mix of fantasy, horror, and some literary fiction, mainly queer literary fiction. I lean heavy into fantasy. Fantasy is my favorite genre, but I do feel like I do read a mix of books just generally, and I read them for different things. I don't necessarily expect certain things from fantasy. Like, I don't think fantasy is gonna give me everything that I love in reading and like why I love reading, and I don't think horror is gonna do that, or literary fiction. So it makes sense to me to have a pretty big collection of different genres here. And I think we all know this. I think I've been saying this since the dawn of my channel, but character driven. I am a character driven person. I love plot and world building and all of those things, but characters are my #1. Thank you for sitting through this 5-star tier ranking / 5-star audit with me. I know the audits look so much different on other people's channels, but I just kind of wanted to tier rank my 5 stars as well to kind of see like, what do I prioritize in my reads / other things that I like, but I don't necessarily love, you know? But anyway, thank you so much for making it through this video with me. If you did, please feel free to leave a chart, like one of those little chart emojis down below. Also, remember to check out Meg's channel down below. I will have all of her information linked along with the original 5-star audit. But otherwise, I will talk to you later, friends. Bye.